How I became involved in food writing is an interesting question, because I'd always been interested in food, and as a kid, I was interested in cooking rather than eating. Eating came much, much later. I'd written my first restaurant review for The Age when I was on staff in 1980. And then in 1983, Claude asked me if I'd join him in editing The Age Good Food Guide. When we reviewed restaurants for the guide, Claude and I travelled all over the place. There was no place so remote we weren't prepared to drive there, which meant that my kids, who were growing up in the 80s, because they were born in the early 80s, got to see a great deal of regional Victoria, because we'd take summer holidays and Easter holidays, and I'd say, come on, there are restaurants we need to look at. And I began collecting menus when I began reviewing restaurants, because you could ask, our habit was to introduce ourselves after we'd paid the bill. And we'd ask for a copy of the menu, which became a record beyond the notes we took. And those menus just kept growing, and they became a terrific way of checking year to year how prices had changed, how menus had changed, how dishes had changed. Over the years, the collection grew and grew and grew. Now, every menu had something special. Well, most menus, I'm honest, most menus had something special. Two Faces was interesting because it was the menu that wasn't handwritten. Even the daily specials weren't handwritten. Printed menus were a sign of great formality, and we didn't have menus that were written like shopping lists. Beef, Jerusalem artichokes, mushroom, olive dust. And you think, but how's that cooked? There were some menus which went on for line after line, which were a kind of description of how the thing was cooked. So if you didn't bring your glasses with you, you were in trouble. And there were, the thing I didn't like, it's easier to describe what I didn't like. I was always wary of purple prose in menus, and I watched out for verbs. I didn't like things cascading. I didn't like things resting. I particularly didn't like things resting atop a nest of whatever it was. It's interesting how things change, because they tend to go round in a great circle, and at the beginning and end of the circle, people look at each other both ends look at each other with surprise and say, oh, fancy meeting you here. In the early 80s, there were lots of very small growers and suppliers who knew that because there were restaurants opening all the time, they had an assured market. They had niche markets. And that's where we are now. Only there are lots more restaurants now. The 80s were a roller coaster, in fact. The 80s were, I think there were 2 or 3 recessions during the 80s, and it had a brief time of gorgeous, gorgeous excess. Just fabulous excess. There were chefs brought from France and from all over the place. There were wine dinners, the like of which I have never, ever seen again. So there were a few years where the motto was, if you've got it, flaunt it. In the early 80s, Chardonnay was new and exciting. Chardonnay was the wine, and you couldn't give Shiraz away. Pinot Grigio didn't exist. Riesling was having its same, now we love it, now we don't, life. What else was around? Cabernet was big. Yarra Valley Cabernet was fabulous in the 80s. We're getting things now we didn't get then. We're getting, for instance, shiitake mushrooms weren't grown in Victoria anywhere in the 80s. There are now shiitake mushrooms grown in the Otways by suppliers who are doing fabulous things. We didn't have, we didn't have rocket in the early 80s. It was so, I'd like to go back there actually. I get so tired of rocket salads. The wine industry has had a major part to play in the revitalisation of food in regional Victoria. Where there are good wineries, you get people travelling who want to eat well. So you get a market created.